Well, last clip you saw, there was just some random footages of me doing random stuff. Anyway, welcome to Alpha Pro again. I hope you all are doing good inside home, safe and sound. And I'm back to you with some new tips and tricks. We're here to talk about the cinematic settings which I often use, which everyone should often use when they're filming any kind of videos. If you have a DSLR or mirrorless or any kind of camera which has manual mode and manual controls over your camera, then you're pretty much good to go. Without explaining much, let's dive into the 5 tips for filming cinematic videos with your camera. Tip number 1, adjust your picture profile. The picture profile is mainly those profile and settings those used in your camera to adjust your saturation, sharpness, color tone, basically these things. When you want to start filming with your camera, you must adjust these settings, and first of all, set your sharpness to 0, value 0, nothing but +1 or 2, just 0, because these cameras using the algorithms to sharpen your image or footages, they often come out good for photos, but they just ruins your video. You can always sharpen your footages in post, but just dial it down. In the same way, dial the sharpness down to 1 or 2 or 0, but don't dial it much more than 0, because you can always add colors, but you can't remove those colors and they don't work really well with color tuning. We're basically going for a flat profile image. So we can add stuff, but we can't remove those completely, especially when you're not shooting in RAW mode. And the chances is in pretty much basic DSLR and mirrorless cameras, they don't support RAW mode. We're trying to kind of mimicking the log mode in our basic cameras by tuning these sharpness, contrast and saturations down to minimum values. Just dial down the saturations, the contrast and the overall video will look washed out. But don't worry, these washed out videos come in handy in post-production. For Sony mirrorless or Sony cameras, you can follow this chart, and for Canon cameras, you can follow this guide to adjust your picture profile for video mode. Tip number 2 is adjusting your FPS as you should. The most cinematic FPS is known to be 23.976 or 24 FPS, but that doesn't mean that you always have to shoot 24 FPS for that. If you're shooting for a person talking in front of the camera or some people talking, then you must shoot in 24 FPS because you cannot slow it down. But if you're not shooting people talking, if you're shooting actions or music videos or something like that, you can tune in to 30 FPS, 60 FPS and obviously 120 and 240 FPS if there's an option for you, because it gives you more freedom. You can speed ramp, slow-mo and do anything with these high frames per second videos. Plan before you shoot, adjust your FPS and everything, then start the shooting. Because you cannot slow a 24 FPS footage much like a 120 FPS footage would do. Obviously there's post-production softwares to slow them down, but they don't work that much in these conditions. Talking about frames per second, and that makes us to tip number 3, adjusting the perfect shutter as your frames. In the industry, the basic rule of this is known as the 180-degree rule. It's more like if you're shooting for 24 FPS, then your shutter speed must be the 180 degree or the twice of the frames. A 24 FPS footage would need a shutter of 1/48. Most DSLR cameras don't have the 1/48 shutter, so 1/45 or 1/50 would do the job. And in the same way, if you're shooting for 60 FPS, then 1/120, and for 120 FPS, something like 1:2 40 would do the job. The reason behind doing this, the 180-degree rule, is having the perfect motion blur as our eye sees. If we dial the shutter more than the 180-degree rule, we'll have a choppy footage with no motion blur in it, just like this. And if we adjust our settings to the 180-degree principle, then our footage looks more natural as our eye would see the scene. Like if you dial the shutter speed more than the 180-degree rule, you'll basically not feel it, but in fast movements you won't have any motion blur as our eye sees, and that looks really artificial. Moving on to the tip number 4 is maintaining constant ISO, and obviously it's always better if you know your camera's base ISO, because your camera delivers the most high dynamic range in the base ISO. For instance, a Canon C100, a cinema camera, would give the best dynamic range of 12 stops in the ISO 850. It's always good to know your camera's base ISO. You can always tune it down or up as you need. It's much better, and you'll get a more dynamic range if you shoot in your camera base ISO. And with that being said, to maintain this perfect shutter, perfect ISO number, you can't always tune as you need, because the lighting condition outside would not be always as your camera would see. Most probably you'll get a overexposed or not even properly lit footages by following these methods. Invest in an ND filter. An ND filter is more likely a sunglass for your camera. If you're outside in daylight shooting in 24 fps with 1/50 shutter speed, chances are your footage is overexposed, and then the ND filter comes in help. Whenever in panning, tilting or moving subject shots, or you're moving with your camera or your subject is moving somewhere, you want the motion blur as the human eye sees. And to achieve that, you need to consider the 180-degree rule. The lighting conditions always you cannot change or control. Use the ND filter and your camera settings to compensate. Moving on to the tip number 5, which is maybe a little tip for you. Always shoot in constant white balance. Avoid auto white balance, because if you're not shooting in constant white balance or in a auto mode, then you'll probably have a very hard time mixing those footages, and the color correction procedure becomes a really painful job to do then. Try to use these manual modes, get in control with your camera, start the filming. So that is pretty much it. Have fun filming, and as you can't go out right now, you can try filming like I did in this beginning of this video. You can try it inside, having some cinematic b-rolls. The possibilities are endless, so don't just waste your time. Spend in some creative stuffs, spread some positivity, stay home, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.